Okay. All right. Here we are today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening,
Happy
whenever
time
you're
zone.
listening. Happy time zone. We're back with Therapy Unlocked, the segment where we talk all things therapy from the unlocked perspective of a clinician and a client. Not my clinician, and actually my sister. And speaking of, I'm going to kick it over to her, and she's got a disclaimer for you.
Yeah, quick disclaimer because I am a professional. I'm not your professional. So nothing we're about to talk about should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. That is it. That's the disclaimer.
For education and amusement, and because I'd like to be famous. So if you could like, follow, share, subscribe, give us a comment, that would mean the world. And as a side note, thank you to all of our new followers, subscribers, and listeners. We have had a great time this week looking at the analytics.
Yes, I
So
saw that we got over 1,000 views and we've gotten several hundred views on several videos. So thank you. Thank you for watching.
absolutely amazing. And on a personal note, to the 44% of our audience that are male, thank you. Also, thank you for restoring just a little bit of hope, because I don't know what you're doing looking for therapy, but you're doing the best for mankind.
Right. And so today I thought we'd talk a little bit about what we don't know about boundaries,
But we don't know
unlocking
about.
or unlocking a little bit of the mystery around that.
So I think that's just a genius idea. Um, Here's the problem. I'm a people pleaser, and that is the ickiest word in the human language to me. A boundary. They're so difficult. I don't understand them. I have difficulty placing them. And then once you do place it, I think my biggest struggle is how to maintain it, how to keep that boundary, how to
Well,
stand up
feel
against any
guilty,
pushback. Yeah.
feel guilty and do it anyway. Yeah, because then you'll feel better later.
Feel guilty and do it anyway. I like that. So I think probably the best thing to do in an exploration of this, and if any of this rings true to you, it's definitely something that therapy has been my biggest resource for. But I think the biggest thing that we should do for the audience is I'd like to hear your description of what a boundary is.
Oh, for sure. So a boundary is an imaginary line. It's an imaginary line where one person ends and the other begins. And it can be a physical boundary, and it can be an imaginary boundary, or emotional or intellectual. And an example of a physical boundary based on a need is when we need privacy, I close that door. So that's a boundary of a physical nature. If I need to not take something personally, then when somebody says that my pink hair causes cancer, I say, okay, sweetie, bless your heart. And I don't take that personally. And then separating from other people's thoughts and feelings. So, like, not being responsible for how somebody feels is a boundary, not sacrificing your own plans, dreams, goals. Did I say dreams?
Feels so
Dreams.
amorphous, the concept of boundary. And I feel like a lot of people these days use the word boundary, maybe even incorrectly, where
Yes.
they might actually mean it's my preference that you don't do that, or I don't care for something if I don't care for the activity that you're doing, or something along those
Boundaries
lines.
are
And
confused
then
with
they may throw back
requests.
and say, that's a boundary.
Boundaries are confused with requests. You may request to not be spoken to in a particular way, and somebody may refuse that request. And so, for example, like you might set a boundary of, no, I can't loan you money. Nobody's going to come take your money. But you might set a boundary of, like, no, I don't want to talk about that. And then somebody continues to talk about that anyway. You have the right to disengage from that conversation. Like, that's a boundary. And the natural consequences of boundaries are what people sometimes have difficulty with, because the natural consequence for most boundary means hanging up the phone, disengaging, walking away, not forever, but for now. And I think of boundaries as like a colander or like a spaghetti strainer, with all those little holes where you can expand and let people in, and you can contract and close people out. And I like hugs. Hugs is a good example. You're going to hug your daughter different than you hug your partner, different than you hug a client, different than you hug a pastor, different than you hug the stranger on the street. All of those hugs are different. When I worked at the hospital, we learned a side hug where you leave a little room in between. They said we were leaving room for Jesus, but that's a side hug. That's a different type of hug. There's big bear hugs. The boundary of a hug is just a great example of how they can be flexible. And they should be flexible, in my opinion.
Boundaries being a flexible thing. Again, I throw back to a lot of people will, you said, make a request and then identify that as a boundary. What would you say are the top boundaries that you hear and experience and help people to set in everyday session?
You are allowed to be unavailable,
Oh,
especially
that's a
at
good
night.
one.
Especially at night. I hear people leave their phones on in case of emergency. I say it'll still be an emergency in the morning. That's my perspective on
Interesting.
that. So I have a boundary with my personal phone where I put my phone on silent between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I am unavailable to anyone, including you, my sister. It'll still be an emergency in the morning.
I know where you live, but no, that's true. That's an excellent boundary. You are allowed to be unavailable. In this day and age, we're reachable through multiple apps, multiple avenues. It's not just a call on the telephone during dinner time. It's a constant stream of contact. So giving yourself permission to step away from that would probably be just a regular. I myself did that considerably in the last year. And I found a lot of peace that way, and that motherhood felt a lot less overwhelming without an audience.
Facts.
So
Another
I
one
asked
I've
for,
heard
yep.
Another one I've heard is like when people don't know how to separate their feelings from their partners, and sometimes people will allow a partner's mood to dictate their own level of happiness or sadness. That's a boundary, an emotional one. But yeah, if your partner works up in a mood, like you don't have to be in a mood just because they have an attitude.
That is fascinating. That's a really out of the box concept for me to consider as a boundary, because I've always, to steal the terminology, consider myself to be empathetic, to take on the moods of the people around me. I never considered it to be a boundary to make the conscious choice not to. So I can see where that would be just a continual lesson for some people.
The last one I'll mention, it's a very big one, taking responsibility. Like a lot of people think that life happens to them. That's called an external locus of control. When we have an internal locus of control, we take responsibility for our lives and we don't blame others for our problems. If we're in financial ruin, we figure out how to budget, we figure out how to crawl out of it. We don't blame other people for us not winning the lottery. The lottery
Mhm.
is not the thing to get rich, if that makes any sense. Like taking responsibility of what we can control, accepting the things that are outside of our control, and figuring it out what we can do with the things that are within our control is a way to have that boundary within ourselves to take control of what we let. I'm redundant here, but to take control of what we can control, which is the me, myself, and I of it, life, right?
So that's a really an internal boundary. So you've gone through, some multiple things here. An external boundary being, I'm not going to allow you to come into this room. I'm not going to, I'm closing the door. I'm locking the door. I'm turning the phone off. I'm going to be unavailable. This is external. This is a choice I'm making outside of myself. And then you have an interpersonal boundary with a partner or maybe a roommate or a family member. I'm not going to let their mood become my mood. And that would be, really interpersonal, but probably primarily an internal decision. And then another internal decision would be I will not look at this situation as something happening to me, but as something that is happening while I am here. That is deeply internal. It's almost like you went from external complete level and then downward, inward to the very depths of like what a boundary is inside of you. My question is, at all of those levels, what do you do when someone doesn't respect a boundary?
Run. Run. You don't have to run, but you can reiterate the boundary. You can reiterate the consequences of not respecting that boundary. And sometimes at the end of the day, the natural consequence of someone overrunning our boundaries is that we walk away from the unhealthy situation. But there are some, I guess, things that would keep people from setting healthy boundaries that are legitimate concerns. So fear, guilt, not having the skills, and safety. So, like if you're dealing with somebody who's physically dangerous or threatening to you, it might not be safe to set a boundary. And so, if you're in that kind of situation, work with your counselor or therapist to create like a safety plan and an exit plan to get out of that situation. They do have like domestic violence shelters and all that kind of good stuff. But simply not being taught boundaries is one reason that some people don't have them. And then that guilt feeling that people get when they set boundaries because they feel like they're doing something wrong and maybe it's perceived as offensive when really it's a defensive weapon. Not weapon, but
Mhm.
tactic. Yeah, it's perceived sometimes as an offensive weapon when really boundaries are a defensive tactic to protect our treasures. We
I
figure
would say
out,
true boundaries are a defensive tactic,
yes,
and that they can often be masquerading as something that is offensive to the perspective of other people.
I'll give you an example. A personal boundary of mine is that I can't be yelled at. Does that mean that there can't be yelling when I go to a concert? No, not at all.
Mhm.
It just means that maybe I wear earplugs. So it kind of drowns it out a little. But we're not responsible for enforcing our boundaries upon others. We request those boundaries to be followed. And that's more of a request than a boundary. But like the guilt feelings that come from saying no to somebody or not answering the phone when somebody needs something or not giving them money when somebody asks for money, all of those things can produce guilt feelings. But when we're preserving our own finances or preserving our own self-respect, that will pass. Like that guilt feeling might be there for a little while. It will pass when you realize, oh, okay, I can still get groceries this weekend because I said no to loaning that person $100 or whatever the case may be.
It's the old needing to put your oxygen mask on before you can assist others. Um, that's definitely, I think that a lot of people pleasers in general, and I self identify as a people pleaser to any of the rest of you out there. I wish you an easy day and happy guests. But there is there is a definite issue with boundaries and people pleasing, where if you have that people pleasing personality, it is very much a struggle to access the other. And like you said, it feels really icky when you go to set a boundary because you know that there's a possibility that someone is going to be unhappy with that, and they're going to come back at you either in a negative fashion or my least favorite, which is when people try to just chip away at a particular boundary. So suppose, you said I am unavailable between this time and this time, and I started popping up at the house instead because I can't call you. I found a loophole in your boundary and I'm going to chip away at it. And then maybe you said, don't come by the house anymore during this time and this time. And so I sent you a singing telegram at that point in time, but it was, what are you upset about? I got you that. It's very nice. It was expensive. People who chip away at a boundary, if you are a people pleaser, man, that's just more and more opportunities for you to drop the boundary for the ease of the situation. So if you're, I guess my long-winded point here being, if you have a client sitting there in that chair that's complaining about these top three things and they're not self-identifying them as boundaries, how do you broach the subject?
How do you broach the subject of that's a boundary you need to set?
Exactly.
Oh, I'd be blunt about it. That's just my personality. If I see something, I say something.
Thank you for joining us for this week's segment of Therapy Unlock, where we spoke about boundaries. Please join us for the continuation of this conversation next Friday. We are now available on most major streaming platforms, and we welcome you to join us on Instagram and YouTube and chime in with your comments and questions. We would love to have you be a part of the conversation, and thank you so much for listening.